She fixed his wagon while he was inside a saloon. When he walked out and found a stranger's hands on his property, he pulled back the hammer of his Colt revolver, 14 inches from the back of her head. But instead of begging, she said, "You can shoot me, or you can look at your left rear wheel and thank me for keeping you from dying on Monarch Pass. I recommend the second option." She didn't know his real name. He didn't know she was the daughter of the man his father had murdered, and neither of them knew that this broken wagon wheel would start a chain of events that would burn down a building, expose a criminal empire, and force two people who swore they'd never need anyone to need each other. This is the story of Clara Vance and Quad Northfield, and it will change the way you think about trust, forgiveness, and what it really means to fix something that's broken. The lesson. This story teaches us one powerful truth. Hiding the truth to protect someone is just another way of not trusting them. Real love isn't built on perfect people. It's built on honest ones. And sometimes the bravest thing you'll ever do isn't walking away. It's staying. The meaning, we all carry broken things. Grief, pride, fear of being seen for who we really are. Clara and Quad remind us that you don't have to fix yourself alone, but you have to be brave enough to show someone where the cracks are, because no one can repair what they cannot see. If this story hits something real inside you, don't let it disappear into the algorithm. A simple like tells us you felt it. A comment sharing which moment stayed with you helps others find this story too. And if you know someone who needs to hear that it's okay to let people in, share this with them. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that might be exactly what you needed to hear today. Clara Vance heard the wood crack before she saw the wagon, and she knew, the way she knew hot steel from cold, by the color of the glow, that someone was going to die if they tried to drive that rig out of town. But that was later. That was midday when the September sun hung over Montreux, Colorado like a branding iron pressed flat against the sky. First came the morning, the way every morning had come for the past 6 months, with Clara alone in the forge her father built, lighting a fire no one had asked her to light, checking an order board with 2 small jobs that would not come close to covering the rent. She struck a match and held it to the kindling beneath the coal bed. The flame caught and climbed, and she watched it the way she always did, looking for the color, the heat, the readiness. Her father had taught her that fire told you everything if you knew how to listen. She had been listening since she was 7 years old. She was 24 now, and the fire still spoke to her, even if nobody else in Montreux did. The sign outside read Vance Forge and Repair. Someone had thrown a rock through the corner of it last Tuesday. She had not fixed it yet. There was something about seeing the damage every morning that kept her angry, and Clara Vance had learned that anger was better fuel than hope. Hope ran out. Anger just needed something to burn. She looked at the photograph on the wall beside the order board. Edgar Vance, her father, taken 3 years ago outside this very building, his leather apron dark with sweat, his big hands resting on the anvil like a preacher resting his hands on a Bible. 6 months dead. Riding accident, they said. Horse spooked on the mountain trail. These things happen. "It will get better, Papa," she said to the photograph. She did not believe it. Clara finished the 2 small jobs before 10 in the morning. A hinge repair for the widow Patterson and a set of nails for the church roof. She wrapped them in cloth, delivered them on foot, and collected her pay. $3.40. The rent was $12, due in 8 days. She had $4.60 in the coffee tin under the loose floorboard. She was short again, and the gap was getting wider. On her way to the mercantile for coal, she passed the livery stable on 2nd Street. Harlan Briggs kept his personal horse there, a chestnut mare with a white blaze on her forehead and an easy gait. Clara knew that horse. She knew it the way you know a face you have seen every day of your childhood, because that horse had belonged to her father. It was the horse he had been riding when he died. Harlan Briggs had bought it at the estate auction 3 weeks after the funeral, paid $12 for an animal worth $40, because nobody else wanted the horse that killed its rider. But Harlan wanted it. Clara had never understood why. And every time she passed the livery and saw that chestnut mare standing calm and healthy in the stall, something twisted in her chest that she could not name. She pushed the feeling down and kept walking. She had coal to buy, and she could not afford to waste time on feelings that did not pay the rent. It was nearly noon when she heard the crack. She was coming out of the mercantile with 10 pounds of coal in a burlap sack over her shoulder, when the sound cut through the street noise like a gunshot, sharp and clean and final. Wood under stress. Wood giving up. She turned and saw the wagon outside the Silver Spur Saloon. It was a freight wagon, heavy loaded, canvas stretched tight over a cargo that had been packed with military precision. Every crate lashed down with knots Clara recognized from her father's books on rigging. Every pound distributed to balance the load across all 4 wheels. This was not the work of a careless man. This was someone who understood that a wagon was the difference between life and death on the mountain passes, but the left rear wheel was failing. One spoke had snapped clean through, the brake fresh and white against the weathered gray of the wood. 2 more spokes showed hairline fractures along their grain. The iron tire was beginning to torque away from the felloe, and the axle was taking weight it was never designed to bear alone. Another 10 miles, maybe less, and that wheel would fold like a house of cards. On flat ground, the driver would lose his cargo. On Monarch Pass, the driver would lose his life. Clara set down her coal. She looked at the saloon doors. Whoever owned this wagon was inside, and the smart thing, the proper thing, the thing a sensible woman in a town that already thought she had no business running a forge would do, was walk away. She had learned that lesson the hard way 2 months ago when she fixed the sheriff's saddle without being asked, and he refused to pay because, as he put it, "I did not ask you to do that." She could not afford to work for free. She could not afford the time. She could not afford the trouble. But Clara looked at that wheel and saw what her father had always seen. Something broken that would hurt someone if it was not fixed. And Edgar Vance had raised his daughter on a single commandment that outranked every practical concern. You do not walk past broken things when you have the hands to fix them. She crouched beside the wheel and went to work. It took her the better part of 2 hours. She worked from her belt kit, the small tools she carried everywhere, the way some women carried handkerchiefs. She removed the shattered spoke, shimmed the 2 cracked ones with iron wire to stabilize them for travel, reseated the tire against the felloe using a technique her father had invented for field repairs, and retensioned the axle bearing with a hand wrench she had forged herself at the age of 15. She was torquing the final bolt when she heard the hammer click behind her. Clara froze. She knew that sound. Every person west of the Mississippi knew that sound. It was the sound of a Colt revolver being cocked, and it was approximately 14 inches behind her left ear. "What in the hell are you doing to my wagon?" The voice was low, rough, steady, not drunk, not panicked. A voice that had given orders and expected them followed. Clara stood up slowly. She raised her hands, palms out, fingers spread. She did not turn around. Her hands were black with axle grease, and her knuckles were scraped raw from working in tight spaces, and she could feel the sun on the back of her neck where her braid had shifted. "You can shoot me," she said, "or you can look at your left rear wheel and thank me for keeping you from dying under your own cargo on Monarch Pass. I recommend the second option." Silence. A long, tight silence during which Clara counted her own heartbeats and wondered if this was how she would die, shot in the back outside a saloon for the sin of fixing something that needed fixing. Then the hammer eased back to rest, the leather creak of a holster, a step forward. Clara turned around. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and broad through the shoulders in a way that came from years of physical labor, not vanity. Dark hair that needed cutting fell past his collar, a jaw shadowed with several days of stubble, and eyes so blue they looked wrong against his sun-darkened skin, like someone had set chips of winter sky into a face made for summer. He was looking at the wheel. His expression shifted from suspicion to confusion to something Clara could not quite read, something that lived in the space between surprise and shame. You fixed it, he said. I fixed it. He looked at her grease-black hands, at the tools on her belt, at the iron wire, and the hand wrench, and the careful, precise work she had done on his wheel. How much do I owe you? Nothing, Clara said. She bent to pick up her coal sack. I do not take money for work nobody hired me to do. She walked away. She did not look back. She did not hear him follow. But she heard him ask the stableman a question as she rounded the corner, and she heard the stableman's answer. Name is Mercer, the stableman said. Quad Mercer, paid in advance for 3 nights' boarding. Keeps to himself. Clara filed the name away and kept walking. She had coal to carry and rent to earn, and she did not have time for a stranger with blue eyes and a loaded gun who did not know enough to check his own wheels. Behind her in the street, Quad stood beside his wagon and looked at the repair. He ran his fingers along the shimmed spokes, the reseated tire, the retensioned bearing. He had spent 10 years working ranches across 3 territories. He knew wagons the way most men knew their own hands. And what he was looking at was not just competent, it was exceptional. Better than any wheelwright he had ever paid, better than work he could have done himself. He checked the sealed envelope in his saddlebag, thick with 10 years of savings, and a land deed filed under the name Quad Mercer. It was intact, nothing touched. Whoever she was, she had fixed his wagon and taken nothing. In 10 years of drifting, nobody had ever given him something without wanting something in return. Not a meal, not a bed, not a kind word. Everything had a price, everything came with a string attached. And that, the absence of a string, the pure, clean fact that a stranger had fixed something broken for no reason other than that it was broken, scared him more than the bullet he had almost put in her. He looked down the street where she had disappeared, a woman in a leather apron carrying a sack of coal, walking like the whole town could go to hell, and she would not slow down to watch. Something turned over in his chest, quiet and unfamiliar, like a key finding a lock he did not know existed. He pushed it down and went to see about his land. The letter arrived on Monday morning, on paper heavy enough to mean money and trouble in equal measure, stamped with the brand of the Northfield Land and Cattle Company. Clara did not need to open it to know what it said because this was the 3rd one. The first had been polite. The second had been firm. This one, she suspected, would be something else entirely. She was right. Dear Miss Vance, it read, this letter constitutes formal notice that Northfield Land and Cattle Company is prepared to make a final offer for the property located at 14 Main Street, Montreux, Colorado, currently operating as Vance Forge and Repair. Our offer of $200 represents fair market value and is tendered in good faith. We encourage you to consider this offer carefully, as changing business conditions in the Montreux district may make independent operation increasingly difficult in the coming months. Respectfully, Harlan Briggs, Agent. Clara folded the letter and put it in the stove. Harlan Briggs arrived in person at 10:30, which told Clara that the letter had been a courtesy, not a question. He walked in through the open forge door the way a man walks into a room he already owns, his boots clean, his coat brushed, his hat held politely in his left hand. He was 35 years old, handsome in a way that had too many sharp edges, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. Miss Vance, he said, I trust you received our letter. I burned your letter, Mr. Briggs, same as the first 2. Would you like to save yourself the postage next time? He laughed, a short sound with no warmth. I admire your spirit, Miss Vance. Your father was the same way. Stubborn as a fence post. It is an admirable quality right up until the fence falls down. This fence is standing just fine. Harlan looked around the forge. At the 2-item order board. At the cold spots on the coal bed where the fire had been banked low to conserve fuel. At the rock damage on the sign outside. Is it? He said. He set a card on her workbench. I understand, Miss Vance, but you should know that my company has acquired 3 properties on this street already. Sometimes the last fish in the pond is not the strongest. It is just the one that has not been caught yet. He tipped his hat and left. Clara waited until his footsteps faded, before she picked up the card and tore it in half, then in quarters. Then she threw the pieces into the forge and watched them curl into ash. Rosa came by at noon with a plate of beans and cornbread, and the kind of news that made food taste like nothing. Two more of Clara's regular customers, the Hernandez Ranch and old Tom Mitchell's outfit, had placed orders with the smithy in Redcliffe instead of with her. Someone told them Vance Forge was closing before Christmas. Who told them? Clara asked. Rosa shrugged. She was 26, dark-haired, quick to laugh, and quicker to worry. She ran a small restaurant on Main Street and raised her son Tomas alone since her husband died of fever 2 years back. She was Clara's only real friend in Montreux, maybe the only person in town who treated her like a human being instead of a curiosity. "Does it matter who told them?" Rosa said. "The damage is done. People believe what they hear, especially when it is easier than driving an extra hour to check the truth." Clara stared at the cold plate. "It matters because it is a lie. And lies do not grow on their own. Somebody planted it." Rosa hesitated. "There is something else. That Briggs man has been buying things at estate sales all over the valley. He bought your father's horse, that old rifle from the Dawson place, some fencing tools from the Mueller auction. Man collects dead men's things like trophies." Clara felt something cold move through her stomach. She thought of the chestnut mare in the livery stable. Her father's horse. Harlan's horse now. She thought about why a man would buy an animal associated with death. She pushed the thought away. Ate the beans. Thanked Rosa. Got back to work. 8 miles south of town, Quad Mercer stood on 600 acres of the most beautiful land he had ever seen, and tried to figure out why someone wanted to destroy it before he could build on it. Jim Cotton, the ranch hand who came with the property, stood beside him with his hat pushed back and a look of mild confusion on his weathered face. Jim was 50 years old, quiet, steady, the kind of man who showed up early and stayed late and never complained about anything. He was also, though Quad did not know it yet, sending weekly telegrams to Harlan Briggs. The eastern fence line had been dismantled, not damaged. Dismantled. Posts pulled clean from the ground, barbed wire rolled into neat coils. Gaps opened wide enough to drive a herd through. Quad had worked enough ranches to know the difference between storm damage and sabotage. Wind did not pull fence posts straight up out of the dirt. Wind did not coil barbed wire. "Probably just weather," Jim said. "We get high winds through that draw sometimes." Quad looked at the neat coils of wire. He looked at the holes where the posts had been, clean and round, not broken or tilted. He looked at Jim. "Probably," he said. But he did not believe it. He rode into town that afternoon for supplies and found himself standing inside Vance Forge in repair, looking at the woman who had fixed his wagon and feeling that same strange turning in his chest that he could not explain. She stood behind the workbench with her leather apron on and her dark hair pulled back and her jaw set the way it had been set when he pointed a gun at her. She recognized him. He could see it in the way her eyes hardened and her shoulders squared. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "can I help you with something? Or are you just here to point firearms at people?" He deserved that. "I'm here to place an order," he said. "I need a full set of replacement spokes, 8 gate hinges, 4 door brackets, and a dozen assorted hardware pieces for a cabin build." He paused. "I can pay in advance." Something shifted in her face. Not softening exactly. More like a door cracking open, an inch before being caught by a chain. An order that size would keep her forge running for 3 weeks. She pulled out an order form and a pencil. He gave her the specifications, careful and precise, and she wrote them down without a wasted word. Professional. Thorough. When he signed the form, she looked at his handwriting, and something flickered in her eyes. Curiosity, maybe. The handwriting of a man who had been educated beyond what his trail-worn clothes suggested. He paid in cash. $15, well above her posted rates. She did not comment on the overpayment. He suspected she noticed. He was almost out the door when she spoke. "Mr. Mercer." He stopped. "Next time someone fixes your wagon, do not point a gun at them." He nodded once. Then he left, carrying with him the image of a woman who ran a forge alone in a town that did not want her, who fixed broken things for strangers and refused payment, who had the hands of a craftsman and the eyes of someone who had not slept well in months. He was halfway to the livery when he realized he had been holding his breath. That evening, in an office above the Land Records Bureau, Harlan Briggs set down his coffee cup when Jim Cotton walked through the door. Jim settled into the chair across the desk and gave his report the way he always did. Quiet, factual, uncomfortable. "The buyer for the Mitchell spread finally showed," Jim said. "Name is Quad Mercer, paid cash. Keeps to himself. Former cavalry from the look of him. Scar on his left arm, elbow to wrist." Harlan opened his notebook and wrote the name down in his precise, angular hand. Then his pen stopped, hovered over the page. "Mercer," he said. He said it again, slower. That was Evangeline Northfield's maiden name. He looked up at Jim. "Describe him." Jim described him. Tall, dark-haired, blue eyes, broad-shouldered, late 20s. Harlan closed the notebook very slowly, the way a man closes a book that has just told him something dangerous. "Do not tell Silas," he said. "Not yet." Jim shifted in his chair. "If he is who you think he is, Silas will want to know. Silas will know when I decide he needs to know. In the meantime, you watch him. You report to me. Everything he does, everywhere he goes, everyone he talks to. Especially," Harlan added, "if he talks to the blacksmith." Jim looked uncomfortable. "What has the blacksmith got to do with anything?" Harlan smiled his sharp-edged smile and opened his notebook to the page marked Clara Vance. "Maybe nothing," he said. "Maybe everything. People who fix broken things have a way of finding things that are supposed to stay hidden." He flipped to a fresh page and wrote at the top, "Quad Mercer, ? Northfield, ? Underneath, in smaller letters, he wrote, "Evangeline's boy." Then he opened the telegram from Denver that had arrived that morning. 6 words from Silas Northfield. "Arriving Montreux, 5 weeks prepare everything." Harlan looked at his notebook, at the page for Clara Vance, at the page for Quad Mercer, at the list of properties acquired and properties pending. 5 weeks, he murmured. He could do a great deal of damage in 35 days. Quad's horse went lame at midnight, and when he brought her to Clara Vance's forge at 4 in the morning, he did not expect the fire to be lit. He did not expect to find the blacksmith already working. And he certainly did not expect the words painted in red across the outside wall. "No place for a woman?" He saw the letters first, because the light from the forge fire inside threw enough glow through the open door to catch the paint. Still wet. Still dripping in places where the letters had been slashed on fast and careless. The paint was the color of old blood, and the letters were big enough to read from the street. Quad stood in the dark with Scout's reins in one hand and felt something tighten in his jaw that had nothing to do with the horse. He had seen those words before. Different places, different targets, but always the same small, mean intent. The desire to make someone feel unwelcome in their own life. He could hear Clara inside. The steady ring of hammer on iron, the rhythm as regular as a heartbeat. She was working at 4 in the morning, and from the sound of it, she had been working for a while. He led Scout to the door. The mare's gait was off, favoring her right front, the puncture from the rusted nail already starting to swell. He needed tools, and he needed them now, before the infection set in, and a lame horse became a dead one. Clara heard the hoofbeats, uneven and labored, and turned from the anvil with the hammer still in her hand. She was re-bending her own iron gate, which had been wrenched sideways during the night, torn from its bottom hinge by someone strong enough and angry enough to put their whole body into it. There was a cut on her forearm from the broken metal, not deep but still bleeding, wrapped hastily in a strip of cloth. She saw Quad in the doorway. Her face did not change. She looked at Scout, at the way the mare shifted her weight, at the swollen right front hoof. "What happened to your horse?" she said. "Stepped on a rusted nail near the stable. Puncture wound, right front. I need to clean it and check for depth before the infection gets worse." Clara set down the hammer. "Bring her in." She worked on Scout's hoof for the better part of an hour. Quad held the mare's head and spoke to her in a low, steady voice while Clara cleaned the puncture, checked the depth with a thin probe she kept in her kit, applied a poultice of turpentine and lard, and wrapped the hoof in clean cloth. She worked with the same total concentration he had seen when she fixed his wagon, her hands sure and quick, her voice dropping into a murmur whenever Scout flinched or shifted. "She is going to be fine," Clara said when she finished. "Keep the poultice on for 2 days. Change the wrap morning and evening, and keep her off hard ground for a week. The nail did not reach the coffin bone, so there should be no lasting damage." "Thank you," Quad said. Clara wiped her hands on a rag and looked at him. Her eyes dropped to the cut on her own arm as if she had forgotten about it, and she adjusted the cloth bandage with a quick, impatient motion. "I would have come earlier if I had known you were open," he said. "I am always open." She turned back to the bent gate, picked up the hammer. "I do not sleep much." Quad looked at the gate, at the torn hinge, at the red paint on the outside wall that Clara had not mentioned and was apparently planning to ignore. He looked at the cut on her arm that she had gotten from the broken metal that someone had broken on purpose. He did not ask. He did not say anything. He picked up the bucket of water she had been using to cool her metalwork, found a brush in the corner, walked outside, and started scrubbing the paint off the wall. He worked letter by letter. The paint was cheap, some kind of barn red that came off in long pink streaks when you put enough water and pressure into it. He scrubbed the N first, then the O, then the space, and kept going. The pre-dawn air was cold against his wet hands, and the water turned pink in the bucket, and he refilled it twice from the rain barrel beside the building. When he finished, the wall was clean. Wet, streaked, but clean. The words were gone. He walked back inside and found Clara standing in the doorway, hammer in her hand, looking at the wall. She stood very still for a long time. The forge fire crackled behind her. Scout shifted in the corner, already resting easier with the poultice on her hoof. "You did not have to do that," Clara said. "You did not have to fix my wagon either. That is different." "That is." "Is it?" She looked at him. He looked at her. And something shifted between them. Something that was not quite attraction, and not quite friendship, and not quite anything that had a name. It was simpler than that. It was recognition. The quiet, specific understanding that comes when you meet someone who has been fighting the same fight you have, alone for so long that they forgot anyone else was in the ring. Clara made coffee. 2 cups, black, strong enough to stand a spoon in. They sat on overturned crates beside the forge and drank it, while the sky lightened from black to gray to the thin gold of early morning. They did not talk about the paint. They did not talk about feelings. They talked about work. Quad told her about the 3 years he spent building fences on a ranch near Pueblo, working dawn to dusk for $1.50 a day, saving every penny. He told her about the first fence post he ever drove on his own land 2 weeks ago, and how he stood there looking at it for 10 minutes because he could not believe it was real. Clara told him about forging her first knife at 11 years old. Her father had inspected it, found a flaw in the tang, and made her start over. She started over 13 more times before he nodded and said, "Now you know what good looks like." She told him about the day her father died. How she came home from a delivery and found his horse in the yard, saddled and riderless, and knew before anyone told her. She told it flat, without drama, the way you tell a story you have told yourself so many times that the edges have worn smooth. Quad listened. He did not offer comfort. He did not say he understood. He just listened. And Clara found herself talking more than she had talked to anyone since the funeral, because there was something in the way he listened that made her feel like her words were not falling into empty space. When the coffee was gone and the sun was fully up, Quad stood and gathered Scout's reins. The mare walked better already, the poultice doing its work. At the door, he turned back. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and it sounded different in his mouth than it sounded anywhere else. "If that happens again," he said, looking at the wall, "tell me." "Why?" "Because I know what it is like to fight alone, and I know when it does not have to be." He left before she could answer, rode back to his cabin with the sunrise behind him and Scout walking slow and steady beneath him. He unsaddled the mare, checked the poultice, filled her water, and then sat down at the rough table he had built from scrap lumber and took out a sheet of paper and a pen. "Dear Mama," he wrote, "I am in a town called Montreux. Mountains everywhere, the way you liked. I met someone. Not like that. Or maybe like that, I do not know yet. She is a blacksmith. She fixed my wagon without being asked, and when I pointed a gun at her, she told me to put it away and look at the wheel. I think you would have liked her. She reminds me of you. Stubborn, in a way that keeps things standing. I am using your name here. Mercer. I hope that is all right. It feels safer than the other one. I miss you." He signed it with a single letter. Q. Then he held the paper over the candle flame and watched it catch. The edges curled inward, brown, then black, and the words disappeared one by one. He held on until the heat reached his fingers, then dropped the ash into the tin plate he kept for this purpose. He had been writing letters to his dead mother since he was 19 years old. Short letters, honest letters, letters he could never send and would never keep. He wrote them when the loneliness got thick enough to choke on, or when something happened that he needed to tell someone about. He burned every one. It was the only way he knew to feel anything without falling apart. He looked at the ash in the plate. Thought about Clara Vance standing in her forge at 4 a.m, bleeding from a cut on her arm, re-bending a gate that someone had broken to send her a message. Thought about the way she had not mentioned the paint, had not complained, had not asked for help, had just kept working. He thought about the question she had not answered, why? Because he had seen that look before, in the mirror. The look of someone who had decided that needing people was a luxury they could not afford, and who was slowly discovering that the cost of not needing anyone was higher than they had calculated. The candle burned low. Quad slept. In his office above the Land Records Bureau, Harlan Briggs opened a fresh telegram from Denver and read it twice. 6 words. Arriving Montreux 5 weeks. Prepare everything. He opened his notebook to the page marked Clara Vance. Below her name he had written, Forge, 14 Main Street, refusing to sell. Father deceased, riding accident, March 1883. No other family. Isolated. Below that, on the facing page, he had written, Quad Mercer, possible Northfield, 600 acres south, formerly Mitchell Spread. Former cavalry. Connection to Vance, ? Harlan took his pen and drew a thin line connecting the 2 pages. Then he began to calculate what he could do in 35 days. Clara found the sabotage on a Tuesday 3 feet under the northeast corner of Quad Mercer's cabin, and the only reason she found it was that she had been on her knees measuring for a gate post and felt the ground shift beneath her in a way that solid earth should never shift. 3 weeks had passed since the night at the forge. 3 weeks during which Quad Mercer had become Clara's most reliable customer. And though neither of them would have used the word, her friend, he placed orders every few days. Gate hinges, door brackets, window hardware, chimney fittings, everything a man needed to turn a raw cabin into a home, and he ordered all of it from her forge. She knew what he was doing. He was giving her business because he knew she needed it, and he was doing it in the only way she would accept, as a transaction between professionals. He never offered charity, never suggested she was struggling. He simply had an inexhaustible need for ironwork, and the good taste to buy it from the best smith in the valley. It was, Clara had to admit, cleverly done. And she was grateful, though she would have bitten her tongue off before saying so. She rode out to the ranch that Tuesday to deliver and install the latest batch. The October morning was warm for the season, with a wind out of the southwest that smelled like dust and distant rain, and made the horses restless. Clara noticed Quad's two mares pacing in the corral, ears flicking, nostrils wide. "Storm coming," she said when Quad met her at the gate. "Not till tonight," Jim says. He was looking at the sky the way a man does when he wants to believe the weather will hold, but his bones are telling him different. Jim Cotton stood by the barn, coiling rope. He nodded to Clara with the kind of polite neutrality that she had come to expect from him. He was the most forgettable man she had ever met. Quiet, competent, always present, never memorable. She had spoken to him perhaps half a dozen times, and could not have told you the color of his eyes or the sound of his laugh. He was wallpaper, background, the sort of man you stopped seeing after the first week. She and Quad worked all morning, installing the gate hardware, hanging a new door on the barn, fitting brackets along the cabin's front wall for a porch railing Quad planned to build. They worked the way they always worked together, with few words and good rhythm, each anticipating what the other needed before it was asked for. Clara found herself watching his hands when she thought he was not looking. Big, careful hands that treated every nail and board with the same deliberate attention. He built the way she forged, with patience and precision, and a deep respect for the materials. Around noon, Quad cooked. This had become their routine on the days Clara came to the ranch. He made beans and salt pork and cornbread in a cast-iron skillet over the cabin's stone fireplace, and he made it well. Better than well. Better than anything Clara could have produced from the same ingredients, which annoyed her in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. "Where did you learn to cook?" she asked, sitting on the porch step with the plate on her knees. "Cattle drive from Abilene to Cheyenne, summer of '78. The cook broke his arm on the second day and somebody had to take over. I figured out pretty quick that cowboys will forgive almost anything except bad food." Clara almost smiled. Almost. After they ate, she went to measure for the final gate post installation on the cabin's northeast corner. She knelt in the dirt, positioned her measuring stick, and pressed her knee into the ground to stabilize herself. The ground shifted, not a lot, a quarter inch, maybe half, but the earth beneath her did not settle the way solid ground settles. It gave like pressing on a bruise. Clara stopped. She dug her fingers into the dirt. The topsoil was normal. Below that, maybe 6 inches down, the earth changed. Instead of the hard, packed clay that should have been there, she found loose fill. Sand and gravel and small stones mixed together and shoveled in to fill a space that had been deliberately dug out. She dug deeper. The loose fill extended down to the foundation stones of the cabin. Someone had excavated the lode, bearing earth beneath the northeast corner, and replaced it with material that would shift and settle under the first hard rain or freeze. The stones would move. The cabin frame would crack. Eventually, the corner would collapse. This was not weather. This was not accident. This was skilled, deliberate sabotage. And whoever had done it knew enough about construction to make the damage invisible from the surface. "Quad," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but something in it brought him at a run. She showed him. They both knelt in the dirt, and she explained what she had found, pointing out the difference between the natural soil and the fill, showing him how the foundation stones had already begun to shift fractionally from their original position. Quad's face went very still. The blue of his eyes turned cold. If this had frozen and thawed over winter, Clara said, the whole corner would have dropped. The cabin frame would have cracked. You could have been inside when it came down. Quad looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said the word that both of them were thinking. Murder. "We need to fix it now," Clara said, "before the storm hits tonight. If that rain gets into this fill, the damage accelerates." They worked for the next 4 hours, digging out the loose fill by hand, bucket by bucket, replacing it with packed clay from the hillside behind the cabin, resetting the foundation stones, bracing the corner with timber supports until the clay had time to compact. It was brutal, exhausting, desperate work, Their hands blistered, their backs ached. The wind picked up and the sky darkened, and they could feel the storm coming like a wave building offshore. Late in the afternoon, Clara was down in the trench, tamping clay against the lowest foundation stone, when her foot slipped on a wet patch and she went sideways. She threw out her hand to catch herself, but the trench wall was too far and she felt herself falling. Quad caught her. His arms came around her from behind, one across her waist and one bracing her shoulder, and he pulled her back against his chest. She felt the solid, warm wall of him behind her, and the strength in his hands and his breath against the back of her neck. They froze. Clara's face was turned half toward his, inches between them. She could see the pulse in his throat and the dirt smudged across his jaw and the way his eyes had gone very dark. The moment stretched. A full second, then 2, then 3. Clara pulled away. She stepped out of his arms and stood in the trench with her back straight and her face hot and her ears burning. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was level. Her hands were not. "Careful," Quad said. His voice was level. His hands were not either. They finished the work as the first raindrops fell. Heavy, fat drops that hit the dirt like small explosions and turned the air thick with the smell of wet earth. They got the last of the clay packed and the bracing set just as the sky opened up completely, and they ran for the cabin porch, soaked through and breathing hard. They sat on the porch and watched the rain come down in sheets. The repaired corner held. The cabin stood. "Thank you," Quad said. And this time the words carried weight far beyond a simple repair. Clara looked at the rain, at the dark sky, at the land stretching out into the gray distance. "You should know," she said. "I found boot prints near my forge last week. Same style as the ones near the dig site. Same size, same worn heel pattern. Whoever did this to your cabin also broke my gate." Quad was quiet for a moment. "Same person targeting both of us," he said. "Yes. Any idea who?" Clara shook her head. "But I know it is not random. Someone wants both of us gone from this town. The question is why, and the question is who is paying for it." Quad thought about Jim Cotton and the coiled barbed wire and the fence posts pulled clean from the ground. He thought about the telegram office and the weekly reports he suspected Jim was sending. He thought about telling Clara everything. About Silas Northfield. About the name he was hiding behind. About the empire that was reaching its fingers into Montreux and squeezing. He opened his mouth. The rain pounded harder. Clara stood up, wringing water from her braid. "I need to get back before the trail floods," she said. "I will come by tomorrow to check the bracing." The moment passed. Quad closed his mouth and said instead, "Be safe on the trail." He watched her ride away into the rain, her back straight in the saddle, the horse picking its way carefully along the darkening trail. When she was gone, he walked the property perimeter with the lantern and found the boot prints she had described. Near the dig site, near the barn, near the spot where the fence line had been pulled up weeks ago. He went to Jim Cotton's bunk in the barn. Jim was asleep, or pretending to be. Quad looked at Jim's boots, lined up neatly beside the bed. Wrong size, wrong style. Jim had not done the digging, but Quad would have bet his entire savings that Jim knew who had. That night, Clara sat in the dark forge and looked at her father's photograph and allowed herself to think for the first time, "Maybe I cannot do this alone." Then she slapped the thought down like a spark on dry wood. But the wood was already smoldering. And somewhere in the back of her mind, in the place where she kept the things she was not ready to admit, she could still feel Quad Mercer's arms around her in the trench, steady and warm and strong. She pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes, and told herself it did not mean anything. But her hands were still trembling. He said it not at golden hour on the open range, not with the sunset painting the mountains and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers. He said it at 2 a.m. on a barn floor soaked in blood, while they both fought to keep a dying mare alive. And he said it the way a man says something he has been holding in his chest so long that it has become part of his breathing, involuntary and essential and impossible to take back. But that was near the end. The beginning was worse. Quad's mare Bonnie started showing signs of distress at sundown. She was heavy with her first foal, 2 weeks from her expected date, and she had been restless all day, pacing the corral, refusing grain, swinging her big head from side to side. Quad had watched her from the porch with growing unease. By 9 o'clock, the unease had become fear. Bonnie was down in the straw, her flanks heaving, her legs kicking. The foal was coming early, and something was wrong. Doc Abernathy arrived within the hour, his medical bag in one hand and his spectacles pushed up on his forehead. He took one look at Bonnie and shook his head. "Breech presentation," he said. "The foal is turned. I am a people doctor, Quad. I can tell you what is wrong, but I cannot tell you how to fix it. You need someone who knows horses." Quad knelt beside Bonnie and put his hand on her neck. She was sweating, her eyes rolling white with pain. The hemorrhaging had started, dark blood pooling in the straw beneath her. He knew one person who might be able to help. "Jim," he said. "Ride to town, find Clara Vance. Tell her Bonnie is in foaling distress, breech presentation, hemorrhaging. Tell her I need her." Jim looked at him. "It is near midnight. I know what time it is. Go." Jim went. And 30 minutes later, Clara Vance came through the barn door in a coat thrown over her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders, her kit in her hand. She did not ask questions. She did not hesitate. She knelt beside Bonnie and put her hands on the mare's belly and closed her eyes and felt for the foal's position the way a blind woman reads words on a page, with her whole body listening. "Breech," she confirmed. "One leg tucked back. I need to turn the foal or we lose them both." For the next 3 hours, Clara worked. Quad had seen surgeons in the cavalry, men who cut into living flesh while bullets flew, and he had never seen anyone work with the focus and precision that Clara showed that night. Her hands were gentle when they needed to be gentle and strong when they needed to be strong, and she talked to Bonnie the entire time, a low, continuous murmur that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, soothing and steady and sure. "Hold her head," she told Quad. "Keep her calm. Talk to her." Quad held Bonnie's head in his lap and stroked her neck and spoke to her the way he had spoken to wounded men on the battlefield. Easy words, simple words, the kind of words that do not matter for their meaning, but matter for their sound. "It is all right, girl. You are going to be fine. Easy now. Easy." Clara's arms were slicked with blood to the elbow. Sweat ran down her face and dripped off her chin. At one point, she gritted her teeth, and Quad saw the muscles in her shoulders bunch and strain, and she made a sound of effort that was almost a sob. "Got it," she gasped. "Turning now. Hold her," Bonnie screamed. The sound a horse makes in extreme pain, a sound that cuts through everything and lives in your ears forever. Quad held her tighter, and Clara kept working, and time stopped meaning anything. Then, suddenly, wetly, it was over. The foal slid into the straw, a dark heap of long legs and wet muzzle, and Clara's hands were on it immediately, clearing the membrane from its nose, rubbing its sides to stimulate breathing. A gasp, a cough, a thin, wavering whinny. The foal was alive. Clara sat back on her heels. She checked Bonnie. The hemorrhaging was slowing. The mare's breathing was steadying. She pressed her hand against Bonnie's flank and held it there for a long moment, feeling the heartbeat. "She is going to make it," Clara said. "They both are." And then she laughed. It was not her controlled smile, not the tight, measured expression Quad had seen her wear like armor. This was a real laugh, full and unguarded, the sound of pure joy at something broken being made whole. She laughed with her head thrown back and her bloody hands open on her knees and the firelight catching the tears on her cheeks. Quad had never heard anything so beautiful in his entire life. He sat down beside her. The straw was soaked, and the barn smelled like blood and sweat and new life. The foal was already trying to stand, its legs splaying and folding, Bonnie lifting her head to nuzzle it. Quad sat beside Clara in the mess and the miracle and felt something inside him give way, like a dam breaking, like a wall coming down, like a gate he had kept locked for 10 years suddenly swinging open. "You know you can fix anything," he said. "Not anything," Clara said. She was still catching her breath, still half laughing, still shining. Wagon wheels, iron gates, horseshoes, breech folds. He paused. Could you stay and fix my heart too? The laugh died. Clara turned to look at him. She looked at him the way she looked at broken things, with assessment and attention and something deeper that she usually kept hidden. She saw the scar on his arm, the one he never explained. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, the ones that had nothing to do with tonight. She saw the way he held himself, tight and careful, like a man who knows exactly where his fractures are and arranges his whole life around not touching them. She saw that he had not said it as a line. He had said it the way a man confesses a weakness, reluctantly, almost angrily, ashamed of his own need. What is broken about it, she asked. The part where family is supposed to be. I am not your family, Quad. I know. But for the first time in 10 years, I want someone to be. Clara was quiet for a long time. The foal managed to stand, wobbled, fell, stood again. Bonnie nickered softly. Show me where it is broken first, Clara said. It was not a yes. It was not a promise. But it was an opening, and Quad took it the way a drowning man takes a hand with everything he had. He told her about his father. Not the name, not the details, but the shape of it. The hard, cold outline of a man who valued land over people and power over love. He told her about leaving at 18, about the 10 years of moving from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to matter, never letting anyone close enough to see. He told her about his mother, Evangeline, how she died when he was 12, how his father broke apart after that and never put himself back together, just hardened into something sharp and cold and dangerous. He told her about the guilt, the thing he had done, or rather the thing he had failed to do, the night his father crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He had stood by and watched, and then he had run. Clara listened. She did not interrupt. She did not comfort. She listened with her whole body, the way she listened to fire in the forge, waiting for it to tell her what it needed. When he finished, she said, You asked me to fix your heart, but you should know mine is not whole either. She told him about her mother, Margaret Vance, who walked out when Clara was 9 years old, left a note on the kitchen table and took the morning stage to Denver, and never came back. Clara had spent 15 years believing her mother left because she was weak, because she could not handle the hardness of frontier life, because she looked at her husband and her daughter and decided they were not enough. My father never spoke about her, Clara said, not once. He raised me to be strong, to need nobody, to fix things myself and never wait for rescue. And I became that. I became exactly what he taught me to be. She looked at the foal, standing now on its spindly legs. And sometimes I wonder if I became it so completely that I forgot how to let anyone in. Then we fix each other, Quad said. Clara looked at him, at his blue eyes in the lamplight, at the blood on his hands from holding Bonnie, at the way he sat beside her in the wreckage and the new life, and asked for nothing more than her willingness to try. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was brief, tentative. They were both covered in blood and sweat and straw, and neither of them cared. It tasted like hay dust and copper, and the salt of tears neither of them acknowledged. It was not perfect. It was not graceful. It was the most honest kiss either of them had ever given. When Clara pulled back, she looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up and brushed the straw from her knees and said, I need to check Bonnie one more time before I go. And you need to keep that foal warm tonight. A blanket over the straw, not directly on the skin. Change the straw every 4 hours. She was all business again, all competence, but something in her eyes had changed. A door that had been locked for 15 years had opened, just a crack, and the light coming through it was warm. Quad walked her to her horse when she was ready to leave. The night was cold and clear, and the stars were thick enough to make the sky look solid. He helped her mount, even though she did not need help. And when his hands rested at her waist for a moment longer than necessary, she did not pull away. Thank you, he said. For Bonnie. For the foal. For everything. Clara gathered her reins. Thank me by taking care of them. And Quad, yes. I meant what I said. Show me where it is broken first. All of it. The whole truth. Because I cannot fix what I cannot see. She rode away into the dark. He watched until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the silence of the valley. Then he went back to the barn, checked Bonnie and the foal, and sat down at his makeshift desk. He took out a sheet of paper. "Dear Mama," he wrote, "I met someone. You would love her. She fixes everything, including things I did not know were broken. She kissed me tonight, or I kissed her. I am not sure who started it. My hands were shaking. That has not happened since the war. I want to tell her the truth, all of it. But I am afraid that if she knows whose son I am, she will look at me the way everyone looks at a Northfield. And I could not bear that, not from her. I know what you would say. You would say, tell her. You would say the truth is always simpler than the lie, even when it is harder. You were always braver than me, Mama." He signed it Q. He held the paper over the candle. The flame caught the edge. He watched the words begin to curl. But this time his hand hesitated. Just for a moment. Just long enough to wonder what it would feel like to keep one of these letters instead of burning it. To let the words survive. He dropped the paper into the flame and watched it go. On the trail home, Clara rode through the dark with the stars cold and bright above her, and the taste of the kiss still on her lips and a feeling in her chest that she had not experienced since before her father died. Something warm. Something dangerous. Something that felt like the beginning of a very long fall. She was halfway to town when a thought cut through the warmth like a blade through leather. Clean, sudden, cold. Quad had told her everything about his past, everything about his father, everything about leaving home, everything about 10 years of loneliness. But he had not said his father's name, not once. In all of it, not one time. People hide their father's name when they are ashamed of it, or when it is dangerous. Clara pulled her horse up short on the dark trail and sat very still, listening to her own heartbeat and the wind in the pines, and the small, cold voice in the back of her mind that said, "Ask him. Whatever it is, make him tell you." She would. She promised herself she would. But not tonight. Tonight she let the warmth win. Rosa Delgado dropped the plate when she heard the name, and the way it broke on the floor into pieces too sharp and too small to ever fit back together told Clara everything she needed to know about what was coming next. They were in Rosa's restaurant, the small, clean room on Main Street where Rosa served meals to anyone who could pay, and sometimes to those who could not. It was late afternoon, the slow hour between lunch and dinner when the tables were empty and the kitchen smelled like beans simmering and corn tortillas warming on the iron griddle. Clara had come by to talk. This itself was unusual. Clara Vance did not come by to talk. Clara Vance came by to pick up a plate, exchange 3 sentences, and leave. But today she sat down at the corner table and accepted a cup of coffee, and for the first time in their friendship, started talking about a man. She did not gush. Clara Vance did not gush. She spoke about Quad Mercer the way she spoke about a good piece of iron, with respect and precision. She described his work ethic, his patience with the land, the way he cooked beans better than anyone she knew, which Rosa took mock offense at, and Clara almost smiled at. She told Rosa about fixing the wagon and the night in the barn with the foal and the sabotage at the cabin. She did not mention the kiss. But Rosa heard it anyway, the way a woman hears the thing another woman is not saying. "He sounds like a good man," Rosa said carefully. "This Quad Mercer." "I think he is," Clara said. But, Clara set down her cup. "He told me about his father, a cattle baron, somewhere in Colorado. Runs a land company, acquisitions, the kind of empire that eats up small ranches. He said he left because of something his father did, something terrible. He has not been home in 10 years. Rosa's face changed. Not all at once. First the smile faded, Then the color drained. Then something moved behind her eyes that Clara had never seen there before. Something old and bitter and sharp as broken glass. "What company?" Rosa said. Clara frowned. He did not say the name exactly, but the letters I have been getting from Harlan Briggs, the ones trying to buy the forge, they come from the Northfield Land and Cattle Company. And Quad talked about his father's business the same way Briggs talks about his employer. The same territory, the same methods. Rosa set down the dish she had been holding. Her hands were trembling. "What was his mother's maiden name?" Rosa asked. Clara stared at her. "I do not know." "Why?" "Because there was a family named Northfield that destroyed my family 10 years ago. And if this man's mother was a mercer and his father ran a cattle company in western Colorado." Rosa stopped. Her throat was working, but the words would not come. Clara sat very still. The coffee cooled in her cup. The restaurant was silent except for the sound of beans bubbling on the stove. Rosa told the story. 10 years ago, the Delgado family owned 200 acres of good land south of Durango. Ranch land, cattle land, land her grandfather had worked and her father had improved, and her brothers had grown up running free on. It was not a large spread, but it was theirs, and they loved it, and they had no intention of selling it to anyone. Then Silas Northfield came. First the offer, polite and reasonable, then the second offer, less polite and less reasonable, then the pressure, suppliers who would not sell to them, buyers who would not buy from them. A tax assessment that tripled overnight based on paperwork that appeared out of nowhere. When Rosa's father still refused to sell, the barn burned. A fire in the night, fast and hot, too fast to be an accident. The horses survived because Rosa's brother got them out. The barn did not. Then the well, poisoned, the water turning foul and dark, the cattle that drank from it sickening within days. Then the eviction order, forged, Rosa's father believed, but backed by a judge who owed favors to the Northfield Company and would not listen to a Mexican family's protest. They lost everything. Every acre, every animal, every piece of furniture, and every memory that could not be carried in 2 wagons. Rosa's father moved the family to Montreux and started over with nothing. Her mother never recovered. She died 2 years later, quietly, the way people die when the thing that was keeping them alive has been taken away. All of it, Rosa said, carried one name, Northfield. If your man's mother was a mercer, and his father ran a cattle company in western Colorado, and he left 10 years ago because of what his father did, then he is not Quad Mercer. He is Quad Northfield. And that name means ash and ruin and everything I lost. The plate Rosa had dropped lay in pieces on the floor between them. Neither of them moved to clean it up. Clara's first thought was not about Rosa. It was not about the Delgados or the ranch or the fire. It was this. He lied to me about his name. He had sat beside her on a bloody barn floor and asked her to fix his heart, and then handed her the wrong blueprints. He had opened himself up just enough to make her trust him, and then sealed the one door that mattered most. "I need to talk to him," Clara said. "Be careful," Rosa said. "The word Northfield is not just a name out here. It is a warning." Clara stood. She looked at the broken plate on the floor. She looked at Rosa's face, tight with old grief and fresh fear. "I am sorry," Clara said, "for what happened to your family. It was not your doing. But if he is who I think he is, it was his father's doing. And blood tells, Clara. Blood always tells." Clara left the restaurant and walked to the forge. She did not ride to the ranch. She did not confront Quad. She went to the forge and lit the fire and stood in front of the anvil and stared at the metal heating and the coals and tried to think. She had been lied to. That much was clear. Whatever else was true, whatever Quad Mercer or Quad Northfield or whoever he really was had done or not done, he had looked her in the eye and given her a false name and let her believe it. And the worst part was not the lie itself. The worst part was that she had asked him to show her where his heart was broken. She had offered to fix it. and he had accepted her offer while hiding the biggest fracture. How do you fix what you cannot see? The answer, Clara knew, was that you cannot. And a man who hides the worst of his damage is a man who does not trust you enough to be honest. Like her mother, like Margaret Vance, who had carried unhappiness inside her for years and never told anyone until the day she left. Clara slammed the hammer onto the anvil, and the ring of iron on iron echoed through the empty forge like a bell struck in anger. That same evening, 8 miles south of town, Quad Mercer made his own discovery. He had been watching Jim Cotton for days. Something about the older man's behavior had changed since Clara started coming to the ranch regularly. Jim was more careful with his movements, more deliberate about his trips to town, more likely to volunteer for errands that took him past the telegraph office. On this particular evening, Quad followed him. He saddled Scout, whose hoof had healed clean, and trailed Jim at a distance along the road to Montreux. Jim rode straight to the telegraph office on 3rd Street, tied his horse, went inside. Quad waited across the street in the shadow of the feed store awning. Jim came out 10 minutes later, empty-handed, and rode not back toward the ranch but south along Main Street to a building Clara had pointed out to Quad weeks ago. Harlan Briggs's office, the property agent for Northfield Land and Cattle. Jim tied his horse and went inside. Through the window, Quad could see Harlan standing behind his desk. Jim sat in the chair across from him. They talked. Quad was too far away to hear clearly, but the wind carried fragments through the cracked window. Silas wants reports on his son. Arriving 3 weeks. Prepare. Quad's blood went cold. His father knew. His father knew he was here, had known for weeks. Maybe from the beginning. Jim Cotton, the quiet, reliable ranch hand who came with the property, had been Silas Northfield's informant from the start. And Silas was coming. 3 weeks. Quad stood in the shadow of the feed store and felt the walls closing in. Everything he had built, the ranch, the cabin, the tentative, fragile thing growing between him and Clara, all of it was about to be tested by the one force he had spent 10 years running from. He had to tell Clara. He had to tell her everything. Now. Tonight. But even as the resolution formed in his mind, the fear pushed back. If he told her, she would know who he was, who his father was, what his father had done to families like Rose's. She would look at him and see Silas Northfield's son, and the way she looked at him now, the way her eyes had softened in the barn, the way her hand had risen to his face, all of that would vanish. He could not bear that. He would handle Silas first. Stop his father before Silas reached Montreux. Then tell Clara. She would understand. She would see that he had been trying to protect her. This was the lie he told himself as he rode back to the ranch in the dark. That hiding the truth was protection. That silence was love. That the woman who had asked him for honesty would forgive him for the one thing she had specifically asked him not to do. It was his greatest mistake. And deep down, in this part of himself that wrote letters to his dead mother and burned them, the part that knew the truth was always simpler even when it was harder, he knew it was a mistake, but he made it anyway. Because he was Silas Northfield's son, and the Northfield men had always been better at hiding than at facing what they feared. That night, lying on the cabin floor, the floor Clara had helped him shore up, the floor that would have collapsed without her, Quad stared at the ceiling and thought about 2 kinds of repair. The kind you do before something breaks, and the kind you attempt when it is already too late. He did not know which kind he was running out of time for. The truth arrived not by confession, but by accident. A folded paper that slipped from Quad's coat pocket when Clara washed it for the first time, and God help her, she wished she had never learned to read. It was a Thursday. The kind of October Thursday in the mountains where the aspens have gone full gold and the sky is so blue it hurts to look at and everything feels sharp and clear and temporary, like the world knows it is about to change and is showing you its best face one last time before the cold comes. Clara had been at the ranch since morning. They had been working on the corral extension, building it out to hold the 4 new horses Quad planned to buy in the spring. They had worked well together the way they always did, and somewhere around noon Clara had noticed that Quad was favoring his left hand, and discovered that he had sliced it open on barbed wire 2 days ago and had been wrapping it himself with a bandage that was filthy. "Give me that," she said, unwinding the dirty cloth. "When did you last clean this?" Quad looked sheepish, which was, Clara had discovered, an expression that suited his face far more than the guarded blankness he usually wore. "A couple days ago," he said. "A couple days." Clara cleaned the wound with whiskey from the cabin and wrapped it with fresh cloth from her kit, and told him in specific terms what she thought of men who let infections set in because they were too stubborn to ask for help. Then she took his coat, which had blood on the sleeve from the wire, and told him she would wash it. He started to protest. She gave him a look that stopped the protest dead. She was at the rain barrel behind the cabin scrubbing the blood out of the heavy canvas coat when the paper fell. It was folded small and tight, the way you fold something precious or something dangerous. It slipped from the inside pocket where it must have been riding for months, maybe years, pressed against Quad's chest like a second heartbeat. Clara picked it up, unfolded it. The paper was old, creased and soft from handling, the ink faded to brown in places. It was a letter, short, written in a hand that was not Quad's but shared certain characteristics with his, the same educated precision, the same firm downstrokes. It read, "You can run as long as you like, but Northfield blood is Northfield blood. One day you will realize you are more like me than you want to believe." It was signed, "Your father, Silas." Clara read it once, read it again. The blood she had been scrubbing from the coat was still on her hands, mixing with the water, turning her fingers pink. Northfield, not Mercer. Northfield, Quad Northfield, son of Silas Northfield, son of the man whose company had been sending her letters threatening to take her forge, son of the man whose agent, Harlan Briggs, had been systematically destroying her livelihood, son of the man who had burned Rosa Delgado's family ranch and poisoned their well and forged eviction papers and driven them from their land. She folded the letter, put it in her apron pocket, wrung the water from the coat, hung it over the porch rail to dry. Then she walked around the cabin to where Quad was working on the corral fence. He looked up when he saw her, smiled. That unguarded smile he had started giving her after the night in the barn, the one that made his whole face change. "Coat is drying on the rail," Clara said. "Thank you." She took the letter out of her pocket and held it up, and this fell out of the inside pocket. The smile died. Clara watched it happen. Watched the color drain from his face and the blue of his eyes go dark, and his whole body stiffen the way a man stiffens when he hears a rattlesnake in the grass. He knew what she was holding. He knew what it said. And he knew from the look on her face that she had read every word. "Clara," he said, "your real name is Northfield." He did not deny it. To his credit, he did not even hesitate. "Yes," he said. "Your father is Silas Northfield, owner of Northfield Land and Cattle Company. The company that has been trying to buy my forge. The company whose agent has been threatening me and driving away my customers. Yes, the same Silas Northfield who destroyed Rosa Delgado's family, burned their barn, poisoned their well, forged eviction papers and drove them off their land." Quad's face was gray. "Yes," he said, "that is why I left. That is what I could not stop and could not forgive." "But you did not tell me." Clara's voice was level, flat, stripped of everything except the facts. "You sat beside me in that barn. You asked me to fix your heart. You kissed me. And the whole time, you were hiding the one thing that mattered most. I was going to tell you. When? When I'd figured out how to stop him. He is coming to Montreux, Clara. My father is coming, and I have been trying to find a way to keep him from hurting anyone else before he gets here. I wanted to handle it first." "You wanted to handle it first," Clara repeated, "without telling me, without giving me the choice to know what I was walking into. You decided for me, Quad. You decided that I was better off not knowing, like I could not handle the truth. Like I was too fragile to bear it. That is not what I meant. That is exactly what you meant." Clara's eyes were dry. Her voice did not shake. But something in the set of her jaw and the stillness of her hands told Quad that what was happening behind her composure was far worse than anger. "You asked me to fix your heart," she said, "but you hid the biggest crack from me. Clara, I am not my father. I know you are not your father, but you lied to me, and my father taught me that a man who lies once will lie twice. The only difference is the second time he is better at it." She turned and walked away. She did not slam the gate. She closed it gently. The quiet click of the latch dropping sounded in the silence of the yard like a bone breaking clean through. Quad stood at the corral fence and watched her go. He did not follow. He did not call out. He stood and watched until she disappeared down the trail, and then he sank into the chair on the porch and dropped his head into his hands and felt something inside him collapse the way his cabin corner would have collapsed if she had not found the sabotage and helped him fix it. He had broken the one thing she had asked him not to break, and she was the only person in 10 years who had tried to make him whole. That night at the forge, Clara sat alone in the dark. She had not lit the fire. She had not eaten. She sat on the overturned crate where she and Quad had drunk coffee at dawn all those weeks ago, and stared at the cold anvil and tried to decide what to feel. Anger was easy. Anger was familiar. Anger was the fuel she ran on, the thing that kept her forge hot and her back straight, and her hands moving even when the rest of her wanted to stop. But underneath the anger was something worse, something that felt like grief. Because Clara had allowed herself to believe, for the first time since her father died, that she was not alone, that someone saw her, really saw her, and wanted to stand beside her. And it had been built on a lie. She thought of her mother, Margaret Vance, who had hidden her unhappiness until the day she could not hide it anymore and walked away. Clara had sworn she would never be like her mother, never be the person who could not handle the truth, never be the person who ran. But was Quad really so different from Margaret? Hiding the parts that hurt, keeping the truth locked away in inside pockets and burned letters, deciding alone, in silence, what other people could and could not bear to know. A knock at the forge door. Doc Abernathy stood in the doorway, his medical bag in one hand and his hat in the other. He looked old tonight, older than his 62 years. He looked like a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally reached the point where his arms were giving out. "Doc," Clara said. "It is late." "I know," Doc said, "and I am sorry. But I've put this off for 6 months and I cannot carry it any further." He sat down on the other crate, the one Quad had used, and set his bag on the floor and took off his spectacles and cleaned them on his shirt, slowly, the way a man does when he is gathering courage. "It is about your father," Doc said. Clara went still. "Edgar did not die in a riding accident. I examined the horse afterward. There was bruising on her flank, on the left side, consistent with a riding crop strike. Hard enough to spook her, hard enough to send her bolting on a narrow trail. The angle was wrong for a self-inflicted strike from the rider. Someone hit that horse from the ground. Clara's hands were in her lap. She looked at them. They were steady. She felt nothing. Or rather, she felt everything, but it was happening at a distance, like watching a fire through a window. "You have known this for 6 months, she said. "Yes." Doc's voice was raw. "I was afraid, Clara. Silas Northfield's reach is long, and I am an old man who lives alone. But that is not an excuse. It is just the truth, and I am ashamed of it." "Who did it?" Clara asked. "I do not know for certain, but I believe Harlan Briggs arranged it. He has the means and the motive. Your father was the biggest obstacle to acquiring the forge property, and with him gone, there was only you." Clara sat in the dark and took inventory. The man she was falling for had lied about his name. The man trying to steal her forge had murdered her father. And the one person who had known the truth had been too afraid to tell her for half a year. She looked at her father's photograph on the wall, his big hands resting on the anvil, his steady eyes. She remembered something else. Weeks ago, at the ranch, she had noticed whip marks on a customer's horse, left-handed strike, unusual angle, and Harlan Briggs was left-handed. She had noticed it when he set his card on her workbench. He wrote with his left hand. He carried his hat in his left hand, the same hand that held a riding crop. "Thank you, Doc," Clara said, "for telling me. Late is better than never. What are you going to do? I do not know yet. But I am not going to sit here in the dark and wait for someone else to fix this." Doc left. Clara sat alone for a long time. Then she lit the forge. Not for hinges, not for horseshoes. She pulled out a set of tools her father had taught her to use when she was 16. The fine tools, the precision tools, the ones meant for lockwork and small mechanisms. If Harlan Briggs kept records of what he had done, and a man that meticulous always kept records, they would be in his office in a locked drawer in a leather notebook. Clara Vance had never walked away from something broken. Not a wagon, not a heart, not justice. Silas Northfield arrived in Montreux on a black four-horse coach, and the town folded in on itself like a rabbit hearing the shadow of a hawk. He came on a Sunday. The church bells were ringing, and the street was full of people in their best clothes, and the October sun was warm and golden, and the mountains stood purple against the sky, beautiful and indifferent. The coach came up Main Street at a walk, the horses blowing steam in the cool morning air, the wheels crunching on the packed dirt. It stopped in front of the Grand Hotel, and the door opened and a man stepped out. Silas Northfield was 58 years old. He was not tall. He was not physically imposing. He was, in fact, rather slight, with narrow shoulders and thin hands, and a face that might have been handsome once, but had hardened into something angular and cold, like a landscape stripped of its topsoil by wind. His hair was silver. His eyes were the same blue as his son's, but where Quad's eyes held warmth, they were trying to hide. Silas's held nothing at all. He wore a black coat and a black hat, and carried a silver-headed walking stick he did not need. And when he walked into the Grand Hotel, every conversation on the street stopped. Clara watched from the forge. She had known he was coming. Doc had warned her. Rosa had heard rumors from the supply wagons, and she had spent the past 10 days preparing. She had not spoken to Quad since the day she found the letter. She missed him. She would not admit it, but she missed him the way she missed the warmth of the forge on cold mornings, an absence she felt in her bones. But missing someone and trusting them were different things, and trust, once cracked, needed time and proof to mend. She had not been idle during those 10 days. She had talked to Rosa. She had planned. And Rosa, whose hatred of the Northfield name went deeper than bone, had agreed to help, not for Clara, for her own dead mother, for her broken father, for the 200 acres of Durango land she would never see again. Rosa's restaurant served lunch to Harlan Briggs's office 3 times a week. Ham sandwiches, beans, cornbread, coffee. Rosa delivered it herself, setting the food on the desk while Harlan worked, invisible in the way that servants are invisible to men who consider themselves important. She had been watching, learning the office layout, noting which drawers were locked and which were not, memorizing Harlan's schedule, paying attention to where he kept the leather notebook that he consulted so often. On the Tuesday after Silas arrived, Rosa made her delivery and found Harlan out of the office. A meeting at the hotel, his clerk said, would be back within the hour. Rosa set the food on the desk. Then she looked at the notebook sitting right there beside the inkwell. She opened it. The pages were organized by property, each one labeled with a name, an address, and a series of notes in Harlan's angular handwriting. Some entries were simple. Offer made, accepted, sale recorded. Others were longer, more complex, detailing the steps taken to persuade reluctant sellers. Rosa turned to the V section, found the page marked Clara Vance. Below Clara's name, Forge, 14 Main Street, refusing to sell. Father deceased, riding accident, March 1883. Below that, a separate line written in smaller letters, as if Harlan had added it later. Edgar Vance, handled, and a date. The date matched the day Edgar Vance died on the mountain trail. Rosa's hands were shaking. She took a napkin from the stack she had brought and a pencil from the desk and copied the entry word for word. Her handwriting was messy, the pencil sliding on the thin paper, but the words were clear. She put the napkin in her apron pocket, closed the notebook, left the office, delivered 2 more meals on the same street as if nothing had happened. That afternoon, she brought the napkin to Clara. Clara read it in the forge, standing beside the anvil, and the words burned into her mind the way a brand burns into hide. Edgar Vance, handled. Her father, handled. Like a business transaction. Like a line in a ledger. She thought she would cry. She thought she would scream. She thought she would pick up the heaviest hammer in the forge and walk to Harlan Briggs's office and put it through his skull. Instead, she stood very still and felt something shift inside her chest. Something that had been pointing one direction her entire life turned to face another. She had spent 24 years fixing broken things. She had defined herself by repair, by the ability to take what was damaged and make it whole. But tonight she understood that fixing was not always enough. Sometimes you had to break something back. Sometimes justice required a different kind of strength and patience. She folded the napkin carefully and put it in the strong box under the floorboards with her savings. Then she went to find Doc. While Clara gathered evidence, Quad faced his father for the first time in 10 years. The hotel dining room was empty. Silas had rented it for the afternoon, the way he rented everything, completely and without negotiation. He sat at the head table with a cup of coffee and a plate of untouched food and watched his son walk through the door. "There you are," Silas said. Quad had expected anger. He had expected recrimination, disappointment, the cold fury he remembered from his childhood. He had not expected what he got, which was a smile. Silas Northfield smiled at his son the way a man smiles at a horse that has finally stopped fighting the bridle. With satisfaction, with patience, with the quiet certainty that the outcome was never in doubt. "Sit down," Silas said. "We have a great deal to discuss." The conversation that followed was the most dangerous Quad had ever experienced, more dangerous than the border skirmish that left the scar on his arm, more dangerous than the night rides through Apache territory, more dangerous than anything involving guns or knives. Because Silas did not use weapons. Silas used words. He talked about legacy, about family, about the empire he had built and the son he had built it for. He talked about Evangeline, Quad's mother, and the way his voice softened when he said her name was the most disturbing thing of all because it was genuine. He had loved her. He still loved her. And the love of a man like Silas Northfield was not gentle or kind. It was acquisitive, possessive. The same impulse that drove him to take land drove him to take people, and when he lost them, the taking only grew more desperate. "I have known you were here since the 2nd week," Silas said. "Jim Cotton is a reliable man. He sends his reports every Monday." Quad said nothing. "The land you bought," Silas continued. "The Mitchell spread. It is part of my survey for the southern expansion. I had it marked for acquisition 2 years ago. When you purchased it independently, under your mother's name, I was." He paused, moved. "I thought perhaps you were ready to come home." "This is not your home," Quad said. "And I am not coming home." Silas leaned forward. "You are already home, son. You just do not know it yet. Everything you have done, buying land, building, putting down roots, that is Northfield behavior. You are doing exactly what I do. The only difference is the scale. The difference," Quad said, "is that I do not burn people's homes to get what I want." Silas's expression did not change. Progress requires sacrifice. Some people understand that. Others need to be educated. "Educated," Quad repeated. "Is that what you call what you did to the Delgado family? Education?" For the first time, something flickered in Silas's eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or something deeper. You were 18 when you left, he said. A boy with a boy's morality, black and white, right and wrong. The world does not work that way. It does for me. Then you are a fool, but you are my fool. And I have room for you in this operation, Quad. A place at the table. Everything I have built, everything I have acquired, it was always meant to be yours. I lost your mother. I will not lose you too. Silas mentioned Edgar Vance then, almost casually, the way a man mentions an item on a grocery list. That blacksmith, he said. Vance. He stuck his nose into the Monarch mine operation. Some men cannot leave well enough alone. It was a shame what happened to him. Quad felt the words like a punch to the stomach. The Monarch mine. South of town, abandoned for years. He had ridden past it a dozen times and never thought to wonder why Silas might be interested in a played-out silver mine. What about the Monarch mine? Quad asked. Silas smiled his thin smile. Business, son. Nothing you need to concern yourself with. Not yet. Quad stood. This conversation is over, he said. Think about what I have said, Silas called after him. I am at the hotel through the end of the month. My door is always open. Quad walked out into the afternoon sun and stood on the hotel porch and tried to breathe. His father had not shouted, had not threatened, had simply laid out the facts the way a trapper lays out bait, patient and precise and absolutely certain that the prey will come. And the worst part was, some small buried part of Quad understood. He understood the grief behind the empire, the loneliness behind the acquisition, the desperate, distorted love that drove a man to try to own everything, because the one thing he could not own, the one person he could not keep, was gone. Silas Northfield was not a monster. He was a broken man who had never found anyone to fix him. And so he had covered the cracks with land and money and power until the cracks were invisible from the outside. But invisible was not the same as healed, and the damage a broken man could do to everyone around him was immeasurable. Quad sat on the hotel porch until the sun went down. Then he rode back to the ranch and wrote a letter he did not burn. Dear Mama, he wrote, I saw him today. He looks older. He mentioned you. He carries your photograph in his pocket. Did you know that? After everything he has done, after all the lives he has ruined, he still carries your picture against his chest. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He wants me to come home. He wants me to be part of what he built. And the terrifying thing is I understand why. Not the destruction, not the cruelty, but the loneliness underneath it. I know that loneliness. I have carried it for 10 years. The difference between us is not that I am stronger. The difference is that I found someone. And I may have lost her because I did the same thing he does. I hid. I protected myself instead of trusting her. I was so afraid of being seen as his son that I forgot to be myself. You always told me the truth was simpler than the lie. I should have listened. He did not burn this one. He folded it and put it in the drawer with his land deed. Beside the deed, there was a photograph of Evangeline Mercer Northfield. Young, laughing, alive. He looked at it for a long time. Then he closed the drawer and went to sleep. Clara was running toward the fire before she knew whose building was burning, and she was not thinking about the forge or Quad or evidence. She was thinking about Tomas, 4 years old, asleep on the second floor of his mother's restaurant. The sky was orange, not sunset orange. Wrong direction. Fire orange, the color of something man-made being consumed by something ancient and indifferent. The smell hit her next, wood smoke and cooking grease, and the bitter chemical tang of kerosene that should not have been there, that told her this fire was not an accident. She ran. Rosa's restaurant was fully engulfed on the ground floor. The front windows had blown out and flames were licking up the outside wall toward the second story where Rosa and Tomas lived. People were in the street shouting, forming a bucket line from the horse trough. But the fire was too fast, too hot, too hungry. Clara did not join the bucket line. She went around to the back of the building where the kitchen door opened onto the alley. The door was hot to the touch, but not burning yet. She kicked it open with her boot, and the heat hit her like a wall, like walking into a forge cranked to maximum, and she went in anyway. The kitchen was full of smoke, thick, black, rolling along the ceiling like a living thing. Clara dropped low and crawled. She could hear Thomas crying somewhere above her, and Rosa's voice, muffled, calling his name. She found the stairs. The banister was hot, but the wood was holding. She went up on her hands and knees, blind in the smoke, her lungs burning, her eyes streaming. Rosa was in the upstairs hall, crouched against the wall with Tomas pressed to her chest. She had wrapped him in a wet blanket, and she was coughing so hard her whole body shook. Her hands were burned, angry red and blistered from trying to beat out the flames that had come up through the floorboards. "Rosa," Clara said, "we go now. Backstairs." They went down through the kitchen. Clara went first, testing each step, holding the door frame when the smoke got so thick she could not see her own feet. Rosa followed with Tomas, the boy's face buried in his mother's shoulder, the wet blanket over both of them. They made it out the back door 3 seconds before the kitchen ceiling came down. The beam fell where Clara had been crawling 60 seconds earlier, and the crash sent sparks and embers flying into the alley like a swarm of burning insects. Clara pulled Rosa away from the building. They collapsed against the wall of the hardware store across the alley, all 3 of them coughing, Thomas wailing, Rosa's burned hands hanging at her sides. "Is he hurt?" Clara asked. "No," Rosa managed. "Just scared." She looked at Clara. Her face was black with soot and her eyes were red and streaming. "How did you know?" "I heard the fire bell and I ran. I did not think. Clara, my hands. I know, we need Doc." Doc arrived within minutes. The town marshal was there too, and half the population of Montreux, the bucket brigade still working through the restaurant, was clearly lost. Doc knelt beside Rosa and went to work on her burns with the quiet efficiency of a man who has seen worse and hopes never to see it again. Then Quad came. He came from the direction of Main Street, running, hatless, his face tight with something beyond fear. He saw Clara first, soot-covered and trembling in the alley behind the burning restaurant. He saw Rosa and Tomas. He saw Doc working on Rosa's hands. He stopped, looked at Clara across the wreckage. Ash was falling around them like gray snow. "Rosa and Tomas," he said. "Alive," Clara said. "I saw Harlan light it." Silence. "I have been following him since my father mentioned the Monarch mine," Quad said. "I was across the street when he came out the back of the building carrying a kerosene can. I saw him pour it. I saw him strike the match." Clara looked at him, at the man who had lied about his name, at the man who had asked her to fix his heart and then hidden the worst of himself, at the man who had just given her the one thing she needed most, an eyewitness to Harlan Briggs's crime. "I have evidence he killed my father," Clara said. The fire roared behind them. The bucket brigade shouted. Tomas cried. And in the middle of all of it, 2 people who had broken each other's trust looked at each other and made a choice. "I am still angry at you," Clara said. "I know," Quad said. "You have every right to be, but that is for later. Right now we have work to do." They went to the marshal together. Clara and Quad and Rosa with her bandaged hands, and Doc Abernathy with his medical bag and 6 months of guilt. They laid out everything. Rosa's copy of the notebook entry, Edgar Vance handled, with the date matching his death. Quad's eyewitness account of Harlan setting the fire. Doc's post-mortem findings, the riding crop bruises on the horse's flank. Clara's observation about the left-handed crop strike, matching marks she had seen on other horses, matching Harlan's dominant hand. The marshal listened. He was a careful man, cautious, not corrupt, but aware of Silas Northfield's influence. He asked questions. He took notes. He sent his deputy to bring Harlan in for questioning. Harlan came in with his lawyer, a thin man from Denver who objected to everything. But when the marshal laid out the evidence piece by piece, the lawyer went quiet, and Harlan's smooth, patient expression began to crack. And then Harlan broke. Not dramatically, not with shouting or tears. He simply stopped talking to his lawyer and started talking to the marshal. The way a man talks when the weight he has been carrying becomes heavier than the consequences of setting it down. Edgar Vance was not killed over the forge, Harlan said. His voice was flat, empty, the voice of a man who has stopped caring. He was killed because he found out about the Monarch mine operation. The marshal leaned forward. Silas Northfield has been using the abandoned Monarch mine to launder money from illegal land acquisitions across 3 territories, Harlan continued. Forged deeds, bribed land office clerks, fraudulent surveys. The money flows through the mine's books as silver revenue comes out clean. Edgar Vance stumbled onto it. He threatened to report it to the territorial governor. So Silas told me to handle it. Handled, the marshal said. Harlan nodded. I hired a drifter, a man named Caleb Root, long gone now. He spooked the horse on the mountain trail with a crop strike. Made it look like an accident. The room was silent. Clara sat in a wooden chair against the wall and felt the words sink into her like nails into wood. Her father murdered. Not for the forge, for something bigger, darker, a web of fraud and greed that spread across 3 territories. She did not cry. She sat very still and felt the anger burn clean and bright inside her, the kind of anger that does not destroy but illuminates, that shows you exactly what needs to be done and gives you the strength to do it. The marshal arrested Harlan Briggs and locked him in the county jail. The charges were arson, conspiracy to commit murder, and fraud. The case would be transferred to the state prosecutor in Denver, and Harlan would be moved to the Colorado State Penitentiary in Cannon City to await trial. Then Quad went to see his father. The hotel room was quiet. Silas sat at the desk, his silver-headed walking stick leaning against the wall, his coffee cold, his expression unreadable. Harlan has been arrested, Quad said. Silas did not move. He confessed to killing Edgar Vance. On your orders. He told the marshal about the Monarch mine, the forged deeds, the bribed clerks. Everything. Silas was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, Harlan was always weak. He was not weak, Quad said. He was loyal. To you. And you used that loyalty to turn him into a murderer. Quad sat down across from his father. He did not raise his voice. He did not make threats. He spoke the way he wrote his letters to his mother, honestly and without anger. You can keep buying land somewhere else, but Montreux ends here. I will testify against Harlan, and I will tell the state prosecutor everything I know about how you operate. Every ranch you burned, every family you broke, every clerk you bribed, or you leave tonight and you never come back. Choose. Silas looked at his son. For a long time he said nothing. Then, slowly, he reached into his breast pocket and took out a photograph. It was small, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. A woman, young, laughing, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Evangeline Mercer Northfield, Quad's mother, alive in the photograph, the way she would never be alive again. Silas held the photograph and looked at it. His hands were steady. His face was not. You are more your mother's son than I ever realized, he said. He stood. He picked up his walking stick. He walked to the door. I loved her, he said, not turning around. I know that does not excuse anything. I know that love without goodness is just possession. She told me that once. I did not listen. I should have listened. He walked out. No dramatic exit, no threats, no final gambit. Just an old man in a black coat, carrying a walking stick he did not need, and a photograph he could not let go of, walking away from the last person in the world who shared his blood. Quad stood alone in the empty room. The silence settled around him like a coat, and for the first time in 10 years, it did not feel heavy. It felt like the silence after a storm passes, the silence that means the worst is over and the rebuilding can begin. Later that night, while Doc treated Rosa's burns in the back room of his office, Rosa said something to Clara that changed everything. You know what I realized tonight, Rosa said. Her voice was rough from smoke and pain, but her eyes were clear. Your mother did not leave because she was weak. Clara looked at her. Maybe she left because Edgar was too proud to see she needed help, the same way you almost pushed Quad away because you were too proud to forgive him. You are not the opposite of your mother, Clara. You are the other side of the same coin. She ran. You push people away. Both of those are ways of refusing to let anyone in. Clara opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, found no words, because Rosa was right. And the truth of it cracked something open inside Clara that 24 years of forge work and iron will and stubborn, magnificent pride had never been able to touch. She was not the opposite of her mother. She was the mirror image. Margaret Vance had run from love because she could not bear to need it. Clara Vance pushed love away because she could not bear to lose it. Different directions, same fear, same loneliness, same broken heart. She sat in Doc's back room with her best friend's hands bandaged, and her father's murderer in jail, and the smell of smoke still in her hair, and she cried. For the first time since her father's funeral, Clara Vance cried. And when the tears stopped, she felt something new in her chest. Not anger, not grief, not the hard, bright certainty she was used to. Something softer, something that felt like the beginning of a thaw. The wagon appeared outside the forge at dawn, the same wagon she had fixed 3 months ago. And this time it was loaded with everything Quad owned, and Clara's heart stopped because she thought he was leaving. A week had passed since the fire. Harlan was in the county jail awaiting transfer. Silas was gone, his black coach rolling out of Montreux before sunrise the morning after his confrontation with Quad. Rosa was healing at Doc's house, her hands bandaged, Tomas sleeping on a pallet beside her bed. And Quad had been silent. No visits to the forge, no messages, no midnight arrivals with a lame horse and an excuse to talk. Nothing. The cabin on the south spread stood dark, and the word in town was that Quad Northfield, because everyone knew his real name now, was packing up. Clara heard the rumor from Doc, who heard it from the livery stableman, who had watched Quad load box after box onto his wagon over the course of 2 days. Everything. Tools, bedding, kitchen goods, books, the writing desk she had seen in the corner of his cabin the first time she visited. "He is leaving," Doc said. He looked at Clara with the careful concern of a man who knows better than to tell a woman what to feel. Clara stood at the anvil and gripped its edges until her knuckles went white. She felt something rising in her chest, something she had spent her entire life pushing down. The urge to run, not away from something, but toward it, toward a man with blue eyes and a scar on his arm and a voice that went raw when he asked her to fix his heart. She wanted to run to him and say, "Do not go." She wanted to strip off her armor, her pride, her mother's legacy of fear, and stand in front of him with her hands open and her heart exposed and say, "I am sorry, and I forgive you, and please stay." She did not move. She stood at the anvil while the fire burned down, and the morning turned to afternoon, and the rumor solidified into certainty. The Northfield boy was leaving, nothing to stay for. That night, Clara lay in her bed above the forge and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Rosa had said. She ran. You push people away. Both are ways of refusing to let anyone in. She thought about her mother, about Margaret Vance, who had carried her unhappiness like a stone in her chest and never showed it to anyone until the weight became unbearable and she walked away. Clara had spent 15 years hating her for that. Hating the weakness, the surrender, the abandonment. But maybe it was not weakness. Maybe Margaret had asked for help in her way, and Edgar had been too proud to hear it. Edgar Vance, who taught his daughter to fix everything except the one thing that mattered most, the ability to accept that she could not do it all alone. Clara lay in the dark and let the thoughts settle, heavy and true. She had been so afraid of being like her mother that she had become her father instead. Stubborn, proud, closed, alone. And Quad had been so afraid of being like his father that he had hidden behind his mother's name and pushed away the truth until it poisoned everything good he was trying to build. 2 people terrified of becoming their parents, making exactly the wrong choices for exactly the right reasons. She turned on her side and looked at the wall where her father's photograph hung. In the dark, she could not see his face, only the shape of the frame. "I miss you, Papa," she whispered. "But you did not teach me everything. You taught me how to fix broken things, but you did not teach me how to let someone help me fix myself. And I need to learn that now, on my own. Because if I do not, I am going to spend the rest of my life standing alone in this forge, and the fire is going to go out." She slept, and for the first time in months, she did not dream of hammers and iron. She dreamed of blue eyes and a voice saying, "Stay." The next morning at dawn, the wagon stopped in front of the forge. Clara heard the wheels first, the familiar crunch of iron tires on packed dirt, and then the jingle of harness and the soft whuff of horses blowing air through their nostrils in the cold. She went to the window, looked out, saw the wagon. The same wagon. Same wheels, same spoke, same repair she had made on a hot September afternoon a lifetime ago. Loaded to the rails with cargo covered in canvas. Her heart contracted. This was it. He was stopping to say goodbye. She pulled on her boots and her coat and walked to the front door. She opened it. Quad sat on the wagon seat, reins in his hands. He did not look at the forge. He looked straight ahead, and there was something in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands that Clara could not read. The wagon rolled past, did not stop. Clara stood in the doorway and watched it go. Watched it roll down Main Street to the burned-out lot where Rose's restaurant had stood. Watched Quad pull the horses to a halt and set the brake and climb down. He pulled back the canvas, and what was underneath was not personal belongings packed for travel. It was lumber, nails, window frames, hardware, and a hand-drawn blueprint rolled and tied with string that he unrolled and pinned to a standing board so anyone on the street could see it. It was a plan for a restaurant. Quad picked up a shovel and started digging out the debris from the fire. He worked all day, alone. He cleared the lot, leveled the ground, laid out string lines for the foundation. He did not look at the forge. He did not send a message. He did not explain. Rosa came by at noon. She stood at the edge of the lot with her bandaged hands and her son on her hip and watched the man who carried her enemy's name dig in the dirt where her livelihood used to stand. "Why?" she said. Quad did not look up. "Because 10 years ago my father burned your family's ranch and I ran away instead of doing anything about it. This is 10 years late, but it is everything I have." Rosa was quiet for a long time. Then she went into the cook tent she had been using since the fire and came back with a cup of coffee and set it on a post beside him. Not forgiveness, but a beginning. The next day, Quad came back, framed the first wall, alone. The day after that, Doc Abernathy showed up with a hammer. Then the livery stable owner. Then 2 ranchers from the valley who had heard about the fire and driven in to help. Clara watched from the forge window. 5 days she watched. Each morning, Quad arrived at dawn. Each evening, he worked until dark. The restaurant frame rose wall by wall, timber by timber. He used the hardware Clara had made for his cabin, the hinges and brackets and door frames he had ordered months ago. She recognized every piece. On the 5th morning, Clara put on her coat, picked up her toolbox, and walked across the street. "Your door hinges are set 2 degrees off true," she said. "I can see it from across the street." "Let me." Quad stood up. He was covered in sawdust, and his hands were raw, and his face was thinner than she remembered, and the blue of his eyes in the October sunlight was so vivid it hurt. He did not say thank you. He did not say sorry. He stepped aside. They worked together all day. The rhythm came back immediately, wordless and sure, like a song they both knew by heart. Clara adjusted the hinges, rehung the door, installed the window hardware. Quad framed the last wall, set the roof beams, nailed the flashing. They did not touch. They did not speak, except about the work. But something flowed between them in the silence. Something that was not forgiveness yet, but was the ground on which forgiveness could be built. At the end of the day, when everyone else had gone, and the half-finished restaurant stood against the sunset like a skeleton growing flesh, they sat on the porch and looked at the mountains. "I owe you a real apology," Quad said. "Not for being Silas Northfield's son. I did not choose that. Not choose, but for hiding it. I was afraid of losing you, so I lied, and that is exactly the thing that makes me most like my father, hiding the truth because I thought I knew better than the person who deserved to hear it." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You know what hurt worst," she said. "Not the name. That you did not trust me to be strong enough for the truth. You treated me the same way this town treats me, like I need protecting instead of trusting. You are right. I will not make that mistake again. You cannot promise that." "No. But I can promise that every time I want to hide something, I will remember what it felt like to lose you. And I will tell the truth instead." Long silence. The sun touched the mountain peaks and the sky turned gold and pink, and the air grew cold. Clara looked at the wagon. The same wagon, same wheel, same spoke, parked in the street beside the restaurant they were building together. "You remember what you said to me in the barn that night?" she asked. "Stay and fix my heart." "I stayed," Clara said. "But Quad, this time you have to stay with me too. No running, no hiding. Stay even when it is hard." "I am staying," he said. "I swear it. Then we fix each other. One more time." He kissed her, not soft like the first time in the barn. This kiss was heavier, slower, tasting of salt and new lumber and cold autumn air. It was a kiss that had traveled through 3 months of silence and betrayal and grief and fire, and come out the other side scarred but whole. When they pulled apart, Quad reached into his coat pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. He held it out to her. "What is this?" Clara asked. "Read it." She unfolded the paper. It was a letter, written in Quad's precise, careful hand. "Dear Mama," it read. "I am not going to burn this one. I'm going to give it to Clara because I do not need to send letters into the fire anymore. The person I want to talk to is right here. You were right about everything. The truth is simpler than the lie, even when it is harder. And the bravest thing I ever did was not leaving home. It was staying. Your name kept me safe when I needed it. But I do not need to hide behind it anymore. I am Quad Northfield. I am Evangeline Mercer's son. And I finally found someone worth being honest for. Thank you for teaching me how to love, even if it took me 10 years to remember the lesson. Your son." Clara read it twice, looked up at him, said nothing, folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket next to the small wrench she carried everywhere. She did not need to say anything. The letter said everything. And the fact that he had not burned it, that he had kept it instead of destroying it, that he had given it to her instead of giving it to fire, meant more than any promise or any vow. It meant he was done hiding. 6 months later, Rose's restaurant reopened. It was bigger than the old one, better built, with wide windows that let in the mountain light, and a kitchen that Rosa swore was the finest in western Colorado. Above the door hung an iron sign forged by Clara that read Delgado's in letters as bold and stubborn as the woman who cooked inside. The forge was busier than it had ever been. After the fire, after the story spread about Clara running into a burning building to save a woman and a child, the town stopped seeing her as a woman doing a man's job and started seeing her as Clara Vance, the best blacksmith in the valley, who happened to be a woman the way the mountains happened to be tall. It was just what she was. Quad and Clara were not married yet. They were building slowly, carefully, honestly, the way you build something you want to last. He came to the forge every evening for dinner. She rode past the ranch every morning to check on Bonnie and the foal they had named Mend, because that was what they did. They fixed things, together. Harlan Briggs stood trial at the state courthouse in Denver and was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and fraud. He was sentenced to 25 years in the Colorado State Penitentiary in Cannon City. He did not appeal. Silas Northfield was never charged directly. He had kept his hands clean enough, his distance far enough, his paper trail thin enough. But the territorial governor ordered an investigation into Northfield Land and Cattle Company's practices, and the investigation spread across 3 territories, and the empire that Silas had spent 30 years building began, slowly but irreversibly, to unravel. Jim Cotton testified against Harlan in exchange for leniency. He was not charged. He left Montreux the day after the trial and was not heard from again. Quad did not look for him. Some debts were paid in full by the act of walking away. Dr. Abernathy retired from medicine the following spring. He said his hands were not steady enough for surgery anymore. But Clara knew the real reason. He had carried a dead man's secret for 6 months, and it had cost him something that could not be measured in years or money. He spent his retirement tending a garden behind his house and spoiling Rose's son with peppermint candy and stories about the old days. On a clear October evening, a year and a day after the afternoon, Clara had crouched beside a broken wagon outside the Silver Spur Saloon. Quad was working on the eastern fence line of the ranch, the same fence that had been sabotaged in those early weeks, the posts pulled and the wire coiled by hands paid to do damage. He had rebuilt it twice since then, each time stronger than before. A rail snapped under his hand. Old wood, stressed by a season of freezing and thawing, giving way the way all things give way eventually. Quad looked at the broken rail. He looked at the mountains, gold and purple in the sunset. He looked toward the barn, where Clara was checking Bonnie and Mend. "Clara," he called. "Something broken out here." She walked out of the barn into the fading light. She saw the rail. She saw him. She saw the look on his face, the one that was not quite a smile and not quite a request, but something in between. Something that said, "I know how to fix this myself, but I would rather fix it with you." "You know how to do that yourself," she said. "I do, but I would rather fix it together." She shook her head. But she was smiling. And she stayed. The wagon stood where it always stood now. Beside the forge, the same wheel, the same spoke, the same repair she had made on a hot September afternoon when she stopped to fix something that was not her problem and found that it was, after all, exactly hers. Some things break and stay broken, but some things, a wheel, a building, a heart, just need the right hands, the right time, and someone stubborn enough to stay until the work is done. And sometimes, the bravest thing in the world is not riding off into the sunset. It is deciding to stay. It is putting down the hammer and opening the door and letting someone see you, all of you, the scars and the pride and the fear and the love that was always there underneath, waiting for the right person to fix what was broken and build something worth keeping. Clara Vance knew how to fix broken things. Quad Northfield knew how to stay. And together, in a small town at the edge of the mountains, they built a life the way you build anything that lasts, one honest day at a time, with strong hands and open hearts, and the stubborn, unshakable belief that some things are worth the trouble of repair. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.